And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, it's about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Wes Montgomery. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of some of the albums we're going to be talking about. Bags Meets Wes is a collaboration album between Wes Montgomery and Milt Jackson, who was also nicknamed Bags. He was also a pioneer of bebop music at the time. This album sees him collaborating with Montgomery on a series of blues melodies. In Paris, the definitive ORTF recording is an album taken from a live recording in Paris. It was incidentally Wes Montgomery's only performance in Europe. Jimmy and Wes, the Dynamic Duo, is a collaboration album between Wes Montgomery and Jimmy Smith, one of the famous pioneers of bebop. On this album, the two superstars perform a series of soulful blues melodies. Movin' Wes. This one's Montgomery's debut album on Verve Records, and it went on to become one of his most popular albums of all time. So on this album, we see Wes Montgomery playing some jazz favorites like Born to be Blue and West Coast Blues. Smokin' at the Half Note is another popular Montgomery album. This one's taken from a live performance at the Half Note Jazz Club. So that was a quick recap of the albums we're going to be discussing on this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, we're talking about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Wes Montgomery. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first album's called Bags Meets Wes. So throughout the 60s, Montgomery was on a recording streak. Here are some of his best albums from that time. Moving Along, So Much Guitar, and Bass Guitar. In 1962, he made an album alongside vibraphonist Milt Jackson. Milt Jackson's nickname was Bags, and he got famous recording alongside the Modern Jazz Quintet. He was also a pioneer of bebop at the time. So most of the tracks on this album are blues melodies like SJK and Blues Raws, a beautiful collaboration album between Milt Jackson and Wes Montgomery. Jimmy and Wes, the Dynamic Duo, is another beautiful album. This one's taken from a 1966 collaboration with Jimmy Smith. He and Wes Montgomery were two of the most popular artists with Verve Records at the time. Jimmy Smith was widely known for popularizing the Hammond B3 organ as a jazz instrument. The result of this collaboration is a series of bluesy, soulful melodies between the two superstars. There's also Grady Tate on horn instrumentals and drums. Movin' Wes, another album. In 1964, Wes made the transition from Riverside Records to Verve Records. So in Riverside, he was accustomed to playing alongside smaller bands. In Verve Records, they wanted to market him as a more prolific, big band type of jazz musician. Most of his albums with this label are backed by large bands, himself playing more popularistic songs in his albums. Movin' Wes was his debut album on Verve Records, went on to become one of his most popular albums of all time. On this album, we see Wes Montgomery playing some favorites like Born to be Blue and West Coast Blues. There's also an endearing solo performance on the waltz, Sense Are Fine. Smokin' at the Half Note, another beautiful album. This one's a live jazz album from 1965 where Wes returns to his small ensemble format for a performance at the Half Note Jazz Club. In this album, he's on guitar backed by Wynton Kelly's piano trio, Paul Chambers on bass, and Jimmy Cobb on drums. There was also a star rhythm section. They'd previously worked alongside Miles Davis Quintet and also collaborated alongside Montgomery himself on his album Full House, another popular live album. And this album's full of swinging rhythms and melodies that capture the essence of Wes Montgomery's guitar playing. Also on this album, Wes was using not a guitar pick, but one side of his thumb to play the guitar melodies, causing them to have a more softer feel than if he'd used a guitar pick. He also uses his hallmark technique of playing in octaves, which he would often do to amp up his music at the end of his solo performance. And an album called In Paris, the definitive ORTF recording. This one was recorded from another live performance in 1965, but it was only released many years later in 2017. Showcases a beautiful live performance from Montgomery and his band, Harold Mabens on piano, Arthur Harper's on bass, and Jimmy Lovelace on drums. There's also a guest appearance by saxophonist Johnny Griffith on some of the tracks. So the ensemble here isn't as high-end as his previous recordings with the Half Note Jazz Club, but the album holds up well and it's highly regarded by Wes Montgomery critics. This also came as a welcome surprise to European audiences who had been eagerly awaiting a live performance by the guitar great. Incidentally, this was Wes Montgomery's only trip abroad because he was encumbered by a fear of flying. So that was a compilation of more of Wes Montgomery's best albums of all time, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. Well, for a short break, be right back after that. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. There's a new album release, it's called Dear Earth, and it's by Wolfgang Schock. So Wolfgang Schock is a renowned Austrian guitarist and composer. His new album, Dear Earth, celebrates the power of artistic expression and the natural world. So this album comprises 9 original compositions, a captivating journey from start to finish. The background instrumentals feature some top-notch performances. There's Grammy Award-winning bassist Carlitos Del Puerto, Grammy-nominated drummer Oscar Seaton, and Grammy-nominated pianist Andy Langham. So this album is a tribute to the world of natural beauty and the planet we live on. There's a song called Artistic Ideologies. This one's based on the fact that the real AI our planet is seeking is artistic ideologies. There's also melodic innovations like the song 12-Tone Blues. This song features a 12-tone row melody and bass line. Each note is played in a different chord. This is after the style of one of the artists who inspired Schock to write this album, Arnold Schoenberg. Lovely Days, a beautiful lyrical song. The title track, Dear Earth, a blissful tribute to our planet. So overall, it's an edgy and innovative album that pushes the boundaries of jazz. For more information, please visit www.wolfgangschock.com. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break. Be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Wes Montgomery's best hits of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, it's about the life and times and best hits of Wes Montgomery. And on this sub, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called A Day in the Life, released in 1967. This was his debut album on A&M Records. It's one of his finest efforts for the label, a series of pleasant background instrumentals. Wes and Friends was released in 1973. This one's a 2 long play set of albums compiled into one. There's a compilation of swinging, soulful songs in this one. An album called Wes Montgomery, The Complete Full House Recordings, was released on Riverside Records in 1962. In this album, we see Wes performing alongside a star background instrumental section. Tequila, released in 1966. This album won him a lot of praise because of his beautiful ballad playing on the album. Also features some of his own compositions like Bumpin' on the Sunset that stood out in this performance. The Montgomery Brothers in Canada was released in 1961. On this album, we see Montgomery and his brothers performing a series of cool pop classics. So that was a bit of insight into some of the albums we are going to be talking about on this hour. This is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, we're talking about Wes Montgomery, his life and times and best hits. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called The Montgomery Brothers in Canada, released in 1961. Now, Wes Montgomery hailed from a family of musicians. When he was starting out, he played alongside the Montgomery Brothers, a music group he made with his brothers. They were later known as the Master Sounds. So this album was recorded in Vancouver, gives us an early insight into the talent of the Montgomery trio. Also a great chance to hear Montgomery's early recordings alongside his brothers. On this album, Buddy Montgomery is on vibes, Wes on guitar and Paul Humphrey on drums. The playing is tasteful and the hits comprise a range of cool bop classics. Buddy Montgomery contributes an original of his own, the track Beau Arts. The song Angel Eyes is another highlight of this album, a beautiful slow ballad. Tequila, released in 1966, is another great album. The title track of this album was a popular hit by the Champs at the time. In this album, Wes Montgomery takes it to the realms of jazz and bop. The album won him a lot of praise because of his beautiful ballad playing on the album, also some of his own compositions like Bumpin' on Sunset that stood out on this performance. Another highlight of Wes's performance here is a technical point, how he ups the octave swing, playing the same note in 3 different octaves. 2 of the songs, Tequila and The Thumb, see Wes Montgomery backed by bassist Ron Carter, drummer Grady Tate, and the congas of Ray Barreto. The congas is a type of drum. The rest are string instrumentals arranged by Klaus Ogerman. Another album, A Day in the Life, released in 1967. So by the time Montgomery recorded this album, he was already a hit sensation in the pop world. This was his debut album on A&M Records. It's one of his finest albums for the label, a series of beautiful background instrumentals. One of the tracks, Windy, is a sensational song from this compilation, a string plus guitar instrumental. Other hit songs are the title track, A Day in the Life, Watch What Happens, California Nights, and Eleanor Rigby. On the title track, it's a Beatles song with an orchestral jazz rendition. Wes and Friends, released in 1963. This one's a 2 long play set of albums compiled into one in a 1973 album release. There's a compilation of swinging, soulful songs in this one. We see Montgomery pairing up with vibraphonist Milt Jackson, pianist Wynton Kelly, bassist Sam Jones, and drummer Philly Joe Jones on this album. The music is relatively light and relaxing. There's a combination of classics and Latin instrumentals. And finally, an album called Wes Montgomery, The Complete Full House Recordings. This one was released on Riverside Records in 1962. Comprises 6 tracks. It also features a star background instrumental section. Pianist Wynton Kelly, double bassist Paul Chambers, and drummer Jimmy Cobb. There's also tenor saxophonist Johnny Griffin. There's a very peppy, energetic song called Blues and Boogie Woogie, which sees the entire band invigorating the audience with a Dizzy Gillespie original. His solo guitar playing takes center stage here. Another Latin themed song, this one's a Montgomery original, it's called Cariba. So that was a compilation of some of Wes Montgomery's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break, we'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We've come to an end of today's episode of the Jazz Update, so now it's time to recap what we were talking about on today's program. On today's show, it was all about Wes Montgomery, John Leslie, or Wes Montgomery as he was known, and he was one of the profound forces in the development of jazz guitar of his time. He had a distinctive playing style, a very swinging style of play that was characterized by his frequent use of octaves. He emerged on the jazz scene relatively late in his career, started recording professionally in the late 30s. He went on to carve a niche for himself in the hard bop and soul jazz genre. In later years, he transitioned into a more fusion-oriented style of jazz. So here's a quick recap of some of his best albums of all time. The Incredible Jazz Guitar of Wes Montgomery, a beautiful album from Montgomery's compilation. This album sees him paired up against a stellar rhythm section. Contains a compilation of classics and original compositions. Cannonball Adderley and the Pole Winners is an album produced in 1960 by Riverside Records. They wanted to make an album collaboration between artists who had topped poles like Downbeat Pole or the Metronome Readers Pole. So this album brings together pole winners Cannonball Adderley, Montgomery, Victor Feldman, Ray Brown, and Louis Hayes. The result is an all-star collaboration album. Move in Wes is Montgomery's debut album on Verve Records. It went on to become one of his most popular albums of all time. On this album, he's playing some jazz favorites like Born to be Blue and West Coast Blues. Smokin' at the Half Note is another popular Montgomery album. It's taken from a live performance at the Half Note Jazz Club. So that was a quick recap of everything that we discussed on today's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. And on that note, I've come to an end of today's episode. I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.